Hello, everybody out there, and welcome to this forum on sustainability organized by Cell Press. In the next hour or so, we'll be discussing challenges and opportunities for restoring and managing coral reefs. My name is Catherine Tate, and I'm an editor at One Earth. Behind the scenes today are my fellow editors, Melissa Pyle, the editor-in-chief at Cell Report Sustainability, and Andrea Steffens, the editor-in-chief at Trends in Ecology and Evolution. A quick shout out to Sarah Roedger and Lauren Manges, who've been instrumental in producing this forum. And I'd also like to thank Abigail Kelly, a fellow editor at One Earth, for live tweeting this event. So if you're on Twitter, you can look there. Just quickly, in terms of format, following a brief introduction, I will invite the keynote speaker, Peter Mumby, to present his thoughts, and then invite our panelists to provide introductions to their research areas. Following that, we'll have a moderated panel discussion on the topic on the future of coral reefs. Can we push the slide ahead one, I guess? It's vanished from me. Excellent. So before we begin, I wanted to quickly highlight that many of the journals at Cell Press publish research related to coral reefs. We've created a collection of recent articles from across Cell Press in a portfolio, which we will encourage you to look at, and we hope that you enjoy it. Finally, I promise I'll stop speaking soon so we can get to the science. But one of the things that makes sustainability research so challenging, but also so exciting, is how interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary it can be. The study of coral reef restoration is inherently interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary because it requires integrating insights from various scientific fields, marine biology, oceanography, ecology, environmental chemistry, to understand coral ecosystems fully. And it also goes beyond traditional scientific knowledge or scientific boundaries by incorporating social sciences, policy studies, and economics to address human impacts, stakeholder interests, and regulatory frameworks. Ultimately, effective restoration also depends on collaboration with local communities, indigenous knowledge holders, and industry experts, making this an endeavor that blends academic knowledge with practical on-the-ground perspectives for sustainable and resilient outcomes. And all of this is why we began the Cell Press forums on sustainability. We hope to bring together scholars and complementary expertise and spark conversation on the complex challenges of navigating more sustainable paths forward. The Cell Press Sustainability Hub, which is linked in the resource tab of this webinar, provides a home for past forums on plastics and fire, and will soon feature a recording of the coral reef forum as well. Finally, before I hand the virtual mic over to Peter to open the forum, I'd like to first highlight some logistical details on our audience. See a restoration tab, which is where some of the Cell Press coral reef related events and journal materials provided, including the collection of articles I mentioned previously. On the right is our Q&A chat. We encourage audience members to ask questions for the speakers, to upvote questions from others that you're curious about. Our behind the scenes team will be adding links and references that come up in conversation to the top of the Q&A chat as well. Finally, we have a quick survey that we very much appreciate you filling out after the forum. So I think I've almost talked enough. I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Peter Mumby. Peter is a professor at the School of the Environment at the University of Queensland. He started his career in the UK with a PhD from the University of Sheffield, a postdoc at the University of Newcastle, and a professorship at Exeter before heading to Australia in 2010. His research aims to better understand reef processes to improve management of coral reefs. He and his students and postdocs work at a range of spatial scales to create ecological models that allow for spatial conservation planning and better marine reserve design. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Okay. So just sharing my screen. Okay, I hope that works. Thank you for the invitation to talk about restoring the future of coral reefs. I'll just move this thing out of the way. I think what motivates this session today is likely the increasing frequency and severity of coral bleaching And as I'm sure everybody watching is aware, this is really a story of light and temperature, and that corals have this hugely successful symbiosis with tiny algae within their body that photosynthesize, and that drives the energy needed to create these enormous limestone skeletons that create reefs. And during the course of the day, that sunlight is being used for photosynthesis, and it can become somewhat stressful on the photosystem. And corals and their algae have ways to absorb that and cope. But as you elevate sea temperature, especially in summer, that light becomes overwhelmingly stressful and toxic and leads to a breakdown of the photosynthesis and ultimately this phenomenon of coral bleaching. And one of my favorite papers that describes these mechanisms is by Susana Enriquez in 2005. And to get a sense of what does this mean for the future of reefs, we've been putting together models of different regions, and I'll share with you something from the Great Barrier Reef, which is a model of the ecosystem itself and many of the environmental forcings, including water quality, cyclones, and of course, climate change. And this is work led by a member of my team, Eve-Marie Bozek. So what we're looking at here is the increase in thermal stress. These are heat wave events over the rest of this century on the middle of the road emissions scenario of 3 degrees warming that we're currently tracking. And as you can see, as you get later in the century, you can see these darker areas getting larger. And these are areas where the combined thermal stress exceeds levels of sort of 8, 9, 10, 12, which can cause significant coral mortality. What we then do is we model the potential future of the 4,000 or so reefs that cover the Great Barrier Reef. So we can model a future, we can work out what the average reef looked like across the Great Barrier Reef in every year. And we've done that for multiple versions of the future. No one knows what the real future would look like, but we can create simulations of feasible futures, and we can use multiple climate models. And this is what it tells us. So this is an aggregation of the average state of the Great Barrier Reef over the rest of the century. And it starts off where the average state is in reasonable shape, and then it declines. And as you get towards the end of the century, under this emissions trajectory, we end up with the average reef having a fairly low state, way below 10%. But it's not in any way game over, because there are many scenarios in which the average state might even reach 10 or 15%, which would mean that some reefs would still have much more cover than that, and others would have a lot less. So it's a fairly bleak outcome. And obviously our primary concern is to try to move away from this trajectory back towards the Paris trajectories. But this is where we're tracking right now. And this, of course, is why investments in reef management are so important. And these methods have been around for a long time. Things like trying to maintain high levels of grazing fish, which helps maintain the reef surface in a state that is amenable to coral recovery and growth. We know that we need to reduce pollutants so that the environment favors corals rather than seaweeds or sponges. And in the Indo-Pacific, in many cases, we also take action to reduce pests like this coral-eating crown-of-thorns starfish. And so with these various management tools, we need to keep applying those. And in many cases, that might not be enough to make the difference between a really beautiful looking reef and a really heavily degraded reef. What it will help for sure is keep that window open for recovery and keep the process of genetic adaptation continuing. We really do need to make sure reefs are managed as well as possible. But I think we can still anticipate that even with excellent management, most reefs will show degradation. And the management will help us limit that degradation. And this is really where restoration has come on the scene as an additional management tool. And I think if you were to pick any ecosystem in the world, you might not pick coral reefs as an ideally suited environment to do restoration. They're quite fragile compared to other tropical habitats. They're relatively susceptible to cyclone damage, for example. They're highly susceptible to fluctuating temperature, whether that's hot temperature or unusually cool temperature. they tend to recover quite slowly. These are ecosystems that can flip and lock into seaweed-dominated states. That can either be seaweed or it can be small algae chocked full with sediment, both of which are fairly hostile environments to coral recovery. And often these environments are quite remote and difficult to access. They might have very high wave energy. So it's a challenge to work in reef restoration. So what have we used it for? Well, perhaps the most widely used and arguably successful use of restoration is to replace amenity value in areas where, for example, tourism is important. This is a photograph I took at a resort in the Maldives. This is in fact a restored reef and it looks fantastic. It's hard to know that this was actually an operation of restoration. Another very important and successful application is in treating reefs that have been damaged by bomb fishing. Now, bomb fishing is rife in parts of the world, particularly Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines. It's not confined to these areas. But when you damage a reef with bomb fishing, the coral becomes so finely broken into small rubble that it's very mobile and it simply doesn't recover on its own. There are reefs that have sat there as rubble for 30 or 40 years and look the same today as they did when they were turned into rubble all that time ago. And so the only way to recreate some kind of function from those ecosystems is through some restoration. And there's a lot of innovation going on as to how to achieve that. And I'm glad Laurie Raimundo's on the call because she spearheaded a lot of that innovation. Another important concept is preventing local species extinction. Unfortunately, this has already become a major issue in parts of the Caribbean, particularly with the limited species of Acropora. This is Acropora palmata, one of the most stunning corals in the world, and it has been ravaged by disease and in a number of areas faces local extinction. And I'm sure Jessica can speak more to that as she's actively involved in that kind of work. And then there's some more sort of strategic activities trying to elevate genetic diversity and thermal tolerance. And you might imagine that you have a population of corals that perhaps don't have very high genetic diversity, or they're not adapted to a very warm environment. Maybe it's a small population, maybe it's quite isolated. And there's a real question over whether these corals have the genetics needed to withstand big heat waves that are coming their way. So one option is to take corals that are adapted to higher levels of thermal stress and introduce them by translocation into the environment so that they can boost the genetic diversity of that population. This is called assisted gene flow. That's a little different from assisted evolution, where you would be taking corals into a lab environment and subjecting them to a very intensive selection regime and breeding them with the view to creating traits that are at the very best of what corals can offer and sometimes beyond what you might see commonly in the field. Importantly, this is not synthetic biology. This is not gene editing. This is just about trying to screen essentially and reinforce the most genetically tolerant corals that could then be reintroduced to the environment and again boost diversity. And again, I'm happy that Madeline's on this call because she's unquestionably the world leader in this area. Okay. Then we can move to some more ecological applications. And so we know that many corals reproduce sexually through these big broadcast spawning events that might only happen once a year. So it's kind of a gamble. And with increasing pressures on corals, you can imagine a scenario where individual corals become so far apart as their populations become less and less dense that they become unable to reproduce successfully. In other words, the eggs released from one colony are unlikely to meet the sperm released from other colonies. And so this can create an alley effect on coral fertilization. And here a purpose of restoration is to just increase the density of the population sufficiently that it switches reproduction on, or it tries to maintain that process of reproduction that's so important in maintaining coral populations. And then lastly, there's rebuilding ecosystem functions like fisheries, biodiversity, reef accretion. And this is really challenging because this requires you to manipulate reefs at the scale of the entire reef. And so if you're trying to recreate or restore a system to a very high level of health at a large scale, that's one of the most demanding objectives you can have. And maybe Jack will speak to these sorts of broader issues around policy and how reefs play a general role in maintaining ecosystem services in these environments. So this is just my opinion on where we are progress-wise. On this axis, we're looking at increasing spatial scale. So at the small scale, replacing tourism amenity, that's done very successfully in many, many locations. I'd argue that restoring areas damaged by blast fishing and preventing local species extinction, there's been a huge amount of progress on that. It may not be completely there, but it's certainly operational, and there's lots of innovation in the field on that. When it comes to these more strategic genetic or ecological questions, I would say that we're not quite there yet. These are really at the research stage. There's a lot of encouraging signs. There's some fabulous research happening. They haven't necessarily translated yet into field demonstrations, but they're on the right path. But when we come to rebuilding entire ecosystem functions, I don't think we're there yet. We're not at the right scale to achieve that. And that requires a step change in terms of the productivity and efficiency of restoration. But then there are many programs around the world. Well, there's several programs around the world actively trying to address that topic and scale up what is possible. One thing we do know, I think, is that we're going to need really good strategy. You know, the increasing scale of climate change requires greater prioritization. We cannot do everything everywhere. And so, fortunately, reefs differ in their resilience and exposure to stress. So we don't have to do everything everywhere. And we need to learn better how to take advantages of refugia from these intense heatwave locations, and also hotspots where it gets really hot, because that's a very different selection pressure. We know that some areas are very well connected to larval sources and some areas are not. And these larval connections can provide a means of scalability for interventions. We need decision support tools to help communicate not only where to do restoration most effectively, but how to help people get a sense of how much restoration is needed to really make a difference. And hopefully that can reduce the number of projects that are just too small to have an impact. And I think we need a scientist to align restoration to complement the rest of the tools in the management toolbox. What tends to happen is that people are specialists in one technique versus another. And we really need to sort of look at them holistically and see how they can work together to generate the best outcome. So some of the key issues that may or may not come up during these conversations, certainly one I spend a lot of time wondering about is, you know, can we stress harden the coral holobiont sufficiently to cope with warming? We've already seen experiments being devastated by coral bleaching events too early. Will it be possible to have an ecosystem-wide impact? What does it take to scale restoration to that level? And I think as the reefs continue to change, will our appetite for risk increase enough to allow us to try interventions that are maybe unthinkable today? And I've certainly seen some increased risk appetite from some decision makers. It's not all the way, but it's moving, and I think it will continue to move. And in some cases, perhaps that's not fast enough. In other cases, this is an appropriate, cautious approach. And just lastly, some final thoughts. You know, people are still going to rely on coral reefs for their food and for their livelihoods in 2100. Our job is to try to make sure that they have as much to work with as possible by that time period. And it means that, you know, giving up is not an option. Our future generations will still rely on these reefs. And I think that also means that there's a huge responsibility on the generations of people who are maybe watching this webinar, because it's in our watch that much of the science and scaling and social license and so forth, it's going to have to be created to make this a successful endeavor. We have to get this right. So no pressure. Thanks very much. Okay.
Can I now get, I think, Laurie to introduce herself?
Hello all. From Guam, we are currently experiencing a storm that is passing to the south of us, and we're trapped at home with very little internet strength, so I apologize for not being there in person. So yes, I'm with the University of Guam Marine Lab and a coral ecologist, and got into restoration big time after we had 5 years of death and dying on our reefs, an unprecedented event in Guam that was never historically recorded to be this bad. We started our work with staghorns, and we're learning a great deal about how to work with them. And we are starting from ground zero, meaning they are prevalent on our reef flats, but we are not even actually sure what species we have. Welcome to the diversity of the Coral Triangle and the Indo-Pacific. So we're doing what we can with a moving target. We are having some small scale success after about 3 or 4 years of working on this. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here and look forward to some robust discussion.
Fantastic. And now I'll get, next we'll get Jack to introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jack Kittinger. I work for Conservation International, where I lead our Center for Sustainable Lands and Waters, working on a variety of commodities and with communities on production systems all over the world, including on coral reefs. And I'm also a professor at Arizona State University's School of Ocean Futures. I specialize in coral reefs, and just happy to be here with some fellow panelists. And thank you to CellPress and to Peter Mumby for that fantastic kickoff talk for this panel.
Brilliant. And now how about Jessica?
Hello, everyone. I apologize. I have to also join by phone due to internet issues. I'm Jessica Ward. I'm the Virgin Islands Coral Program Director for the Nature Conservancy. I'm based on the island of St. Croix in the USVI in the Caribbean. I've been in this position for about 3 years, over which time our program has really grown pretty extensively. We've been conducting, TNC has been conducting restoration in St. Croix since about 2009. But we're mostly focused on fast-growing branching species, Cropper cervicornis, at a small scale and was all field-based. But the opening of our Coral Innovation Hub in 2021 has allowed us to really expand the work that we're doing, including working with slower-growing boulder coral species and facilitated sexual reproduction. The main task of our hub is to conduct coral restoration at scale. And we're currently aiming to plant roughly at least 10,000 corals annually over about 90 acres of reef habitat in some marine protected areas around St. Croix.
And finally, Madeline, I'll get you to introduce yourself.
Okay, well, hello everyone. I'm originally from the Netherlands. Here's a quick overview, and I made my way to Australia via stop in England at the University of East Anglia. And I've been working at the Australian Institute of Marine Science since 2001. And since 2015, I have part positions at AIMS and the University of Melbourne. My research is focused in 2 areas. One is understanding coral microbial symbioses. You know, what are all these microbes within the coral holobiont? What are they actually doing? Are they beneficial or detrimental to the coral holobiont under different environmental conditions, and so on? And I've also worked quite a bit in sort of the conservation genetics area, understanding patterns of genetic structure of corals and connectivity. But sort of over the years, so I'm trying to understand what mechanisms of acclimation and adaptation coral have to environmental change. And so in the last 10 or so years, we've used that knowledge to try and harness those mechanisms. And so we developed this area of assisted evolution, and can we actually help corals evolve and adapt faster and cope with the fast pace of climate change. Thank you.
Fantastic. Now that everyone's introduced themselves, the first question we were having, drawing from Peter's talk, which we'd like to get everyone to answer, is how do we determine when we actually need to step in? Obviously, there were some clear cases we need to step in post this blast fishing, but there's sort of more subtle as the reef degrade over time. Is there a clear cut, or is it going to be? How do we determine this? So maybe we'll start with Madeline, since you were just speaking.
Sure. Yeah, that's not an easy question to answer. So we can set ourselves criteria. Perhaps, once coral cover drops below a certain percentage, that we might need to step in, or maybe once functional or species or genetic diversity has declined significantly, or maybe when natural recovery isn't happening. I think it's important to set criteria when to step in. We also need to make sure that restoration would actually work. Is that reef recoverable? Because if there's really a lot of pollution, for instance, then it's sort of pointless to restore that reef, because we'll lose the stock really quickly. Or maybe if we're in the midst of a crown of thorn starfish outbreak, so we need to assess that as well. Or is the stratum stable enough to restore with corals at least? So those are important questions to answer before we decide whether we need to step in or not. I would say often early intervention, I think, is best, and particularly if we're looking at enhancing climate resilience. I think we could even begin to enhance climate resilience in still quite healthy populations to prepare them for future more extreme summer heat waves.
Laurie, maybe you have some thoughts.
Yes, well, for us, we actually had this, as I said, 5-year period where we were affected by a series of bleaching, disease, and extreme low tide events that wiped out about 50% of what we had. And of course, Guam is a tourist destination. It is a huge source of our economy. So as Peter said, that was one of our motivations. Because we were starting from nothing, we had no actual, expertise per se as a group. We decided kind of on an island-wide basis that we would start with the staghorns because they're very iconic. They are architects of a particular ecosystem that is accessible. They're shallow. And the Caribbean, thank you very much, the Western Atlantic had already done a great deal of work that we could draw on, so we wouldn't be reinventing the wheel. So that was kind of our decision-making process in that early stage, where we just said, oh my goodness, we have to do something. We're just really tired of seeing things die. And we didn't know what we had species-wise, genetic diversity-wise. So our initial response to this catastrophic event was, let's get things into a nursery where we can at least keep some genetic diversity alive and find out how much we had and go from there. So it was literally sort of a Noah's Ark kind of situation in response to a massive catastrophe, not knowing what the future brought. So that really formed the basis for our decisions in the beginning. And since then, we're branching out. We've got more species. We're looking outside Acropora and learning a great deal and using this system to learn a lot about microbiomes, about genetic diversity, about responses to heat from these different species that we're not really sure we have, but we're learning about which ones are species and which ones don't seem to be different. And so it's provided really, really viable research atmosphere at the lab. But that was really the basis for it. And now we can relax a little bit. We know a few more things, and now we're starting to branch out and we're getting more groups involved. So it's quite exciting.
So, Jessica, from your experience, do you have thoughts about how when we need to step in?
Sure. I think it really is regional specific, right? It depends on what's happening in these areas, and there was kind of a recent visit. Last month, I just went out to see some colleagues of mine in Hawaii to see what they're doing, and it was really a stark contrast to what we were doing in the Caribbean. I think most people are pretty familiar with all the stressors that we've experienced over the decades, and in the Caribbean, it was disease, ever-intensifying bleaching events. So we've had a really significant loss of coral for quite a long time. That's been exacerbated by very recent diseases, as well as this bleaching event that's unfolded over the past year and a half. And our strategy in the Caribbean is really to try and just get coral cover back to the point where corals can even reproduce themselves and have that basic ecological function. But in other areas, there's still high coral cover. So in Hawaii, they still have really, really high coral cover. The diversity is not overly high, but compared to the Caribbean, the coral cover is there. That's not the primary need, I guess. So, but following the 2015 bleaching event, I think they had just this disintegration of their reef structure. They have really high bioerosion. And the way that the corals are packed in, it's exacerbated because if you have one of these corals that happens to survive, but everything else around it died and fell away, then you have this big coral bommy that is sort of lacking the stabilization. And what happens is it will break off and roll down this slope and take out all these corals with them. So they degrade into this rubble slope much faster than what we see here in the Caribbean. And we still have these massive stands of Acropora palmata that died decades ago, but the structure is still there, and that's not what's happening in that area. And so they're really having to look at just a basic step of reef stabilization first before they look at the ecological function. So I think it really depends on the region and the specific reef that you're working in and what your needs are.
So related to that, Ajivon on the Q&A has asked, how do we know which species of coral to plant? And I'm wondering, sort of tying into that, what are we aiming to conserve here? Are we aiming to conserve primarily species or ecosystem function? And does the species identity even matter? Thoughts from?
Yeah, well, I'll take a stab at that. When we saw what was happening island-wide, we realized that there did not appear to be any species at all that was particularly immune. We saw individual colonies, interestingly, that responded less severely than others. So with us, it became a question of what can we take on? What is possible to take on? So obviously, in different scenarios, you may find that there are certain species that seem to more urgently need help. And those, if they are valuable, are architecture species or particularly valuable for some reason, that might be a good place to start. There, on the other hand, you might want to work with things that are really looking like they're doing pretty well and could possibly help other sites do very well. So if you have something that's offering a lot of habitat, then that might be a focus for you to consider that as being sort of an integral ecosystem builder that you might transplant in other places to help particular sites going. It's a really good question. And I think it kind of depends on, what your goals are. Are you trying to provide ecosystem diversity, habitat structure diversity? Then you might want to use a combination of species. My colleagues in Saipan are doing this. A combination of species that provide different types of growth forms with a variable set of life history patterns. So you plant those in multi-species groups and you just try to create sort of islands that are doing well. Or you might focus on something that really needs help. So sometimes those are the ways that you have to ask your questions.
Thoughts maybe from Peter on that?
No, I agree. I think ultimately you're looking at a sort of portfolio of species to try to capture some of the diversity of those ecosystem functions. But as Laurie says, it very much depends on what your objective is going to be, and you might have different objectives for different locations. And in some areas that are important for some ecosystem services, whether it's fisheries or tourism, you'll be focused on creating structure and something that looks good. Other areas you might want to try and focus more on promoting diversity. And of course, the method you choose is going to have a big bearing on what's feasible. If you use a method of sort of propagating corals, you're generally going to be limited to maybe up to 10, 20 species at this point. If you're using a method such as larval seeding, where you collect spawn from a natural spawning event and you move that somewhere where it's in need of coral larvae, you're going to capture often many more species. So you've got to weigh up the feasibility as well as the objective.
So Amanda from the chat has asked, here in Florida, there are talks of restoration being a lost cause. She's wondering, what do you think should be done in places that so severely degraded as the Florida Keys? Any thoughts from anybody, or is it a lost cause? Jack?
I'll jump in on that. Well, I mean, look, we're talking about coral restoration, but I think it's probably fair to say that protection and sustainable management of reefs is always going to be cheaper and easier to scale than restoration, right? I mean, even 10 years ago when restoration science was really sort of leaping forward, our ability to expand restoration is now, much bigger than it was 10 years ago, but it's still pretty small when considered to the big picture here, right? So I think, for 20, 30 plus years in the field of conservation, at least Western conservation, we've been saying, protect your reefs, and getting better and sharper on where to protect, how to protect. And then, of course, alongside various forms of protected areas, we're doing reef management, whether it's fisheries management or trying to get a handle on land-based pollutants. But the scale and severity that we now have of the climate crisis, sort of demands that we do all three: restoration, protection, and better production in managed areas that are being fished or used for tourism or other ecosystem services. So, I think it's probably, there are places where restoration, to Peter's keynote, are going to be very appropriate, where there's high amenity value for tourism, or where, community is jumping in to restore a particular area that has, where they're trying to generate some benefits, whether they be fish biomass or other benefits. And I imagine that those efforts are going to continue to scale. Are they going to be sufficient is the question. Are we going to get there in time? And I think Peter put it really well. I mean, do you want the kids of, that are in schools in Florida now to have any understanding of reefs? Well, if you think that that's important for Floridians, then you should do it, because it's the same here in Hawaiian Islands. And I'm hearing my colleagues on the call talk about it being the same in Australia and Guam and Saipan and the Caribbean and all over. So we are all in on the conservation challenge, and it's going to take different forms throughout, but we can't just give up.
Madeline?
Yeah, no, I'd like to add to that. And yeah, of course, in addition to dealing with the root causes of the decline, I think in the Caribbean, for many coral species, one of the issues is the low genetic diversity. And so I think this is an area where some of the assisted evolution, assisted gene flow interventions could be really important, bringing in new genetic variation from different locations to Florida, for instance, using conservation aquaculture to sexually produce coral stock for restoration. So every individual is genetically distinct. So we're not looking at clone mates. So you build up that potential to cope with environmental stresses and also that ability to adapt going forward. So I think a combination, of course, some of the things that Jack said, and removing the stresses, that's an issue all over the world, particularly climate warming is the big one. But I think, assisted evolution interventions in the Caribbean and Florida will be very important. And I know that's challenging with all the different countries and legislative issues, but I think it is important.
That brings us actually nicely to a question asked by Molly Baker about how do we decide which of these different methods of coral restoration are the most appropriate? And how do we prioritize where we implement these different restoration interventions? Maybe Jessica, you might have some thoughts to start to kick us off? No?
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think it's. Sorry, did you say me?
Yes.
Did I shut someone up? I would say, again, it goes back to the region that you're working in and the goals of that specific project. And even if your goals are the same across a large area, like what we're currently working with here on St. Croix, we have had to establish different methodologies just between the different reefs that we work on. So something that worked on this particular reef when we went over to Buck Island didn't work there, and we had to change up what we were doing. And that can refer to the species that you're working with. That can refer to, getting into the weeds of the type of outplanting that you're doing, or the more manipulative types of interventions, like assisted evolution and things like that. So it really depends on what's going to work in that particular area, and that just goes down to trial and error and pilot studies, which I really strongly recommend if you're going to try and do anything at scale, and what your objectives are. So we had originally had integrated a lot of Acropis cervicornis into our work because that's what we had been working with for years. A lot of people had been working with that throughout the Caribbean, and it was the hardest hit species here in this latest bleaching event. And so we've had to completely rethink about how and if we're going to continue to use that species. And we did find some really deep water stands of that species that we're going to test for genetics and see if we can investigate exactly why that is surviving down there. Is it just the depth? Is it the genetics? Is it something else that we can somehow work that species back into what we're doing? We're looking at translocational studies from shallow to deep. But yeah, I think it really depends on the location that you're working in, the particular region, as well as your objectives.
Cool. Peter?
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more. And one of the things I've certainly witnessed is when you bring practitioners together from different parts of the world who are all working on the same problem, and people learn from one another, it has a massive impact on people's sort of readiness to try something that seems to be working elsewhere and cross-fertilize those ideas. And it even needs to happen, within a country sometimes. I mean, there's many countries that have got lots of tourism operators doing something quite unique and not coordinated. And if they got together in a kind of national forum on restoration, they would probably learn a lot from one another and end up with a better path forwards. And, there are conferences, there's Reef Futures, for example, which is happening in Mexico in December, which bring practitioners together. And I think attending those sorts of meetings and sharing methods is really important. And at the same time, I would just say, when you're choosing the method, it's also important to communicate the bigger picture in which you're doing the restoration, because if part of the problem, underlying cause of the degradation, is something that can be addressed through standard management, whether that's water quality or whatever, that needs to be communicated to people so that they don't believe that just this restoration exercise is all that's needed to solve the problem. So I think there's a responsibility as well on the parts of people doing restoration to keep their eyes open to the bigger picture.
Jack?
I should add something to that. And in addition to all those great points from my colleagues and peers here, one of the things I think we've seen in the restoration efforts that my organization's been involved in that's key at the outset is trying to figure out how to finance these things long term. It's not very hard to get some seed funding to start things, but and that's great. We should let 1,000 flowers or coral flowers bloom, right? But to get to a meaningful scale, at least ecologically or socially meaningful, considering that up front, how you finance it is equally important. And I'll give you an example. In Colombia, our program in Colombia has a 1 million coral restoration initiative, and they've outplanted almost 500,000 coral fragments, with the goal being 1 million. One of the core partners is the bank BBVA, and they have a coral reef credit card that their clients and customers can use that gives a tiny little percentage to that effort, but it provides an enduring funding source to support that effort over the long term. And that's just fantastic. And, there's lots of different examples of different financing strategies. And I think that's important to build into the upfront planning as well, because then you can keep it going and build from there.
Fantastic. That was one of our questions we had on the had listed. Madeline?
Yeah, I think it's also important to add that in terms of deciding what to do, we need to involve local people, including indigenous communities, and really develop local governance of the conservation restoration strategies. I think that's really important, and to do that from the word go, not come in and sort of enforce in another nation, for instance, something that might work on the Great Barrier Reef. And so having that, I think Pete said that we need to communicate, but I think we need to do more. We need to empower local communities and indigenous people to be part of that whole restoration effort.
So how might you best involve those local communities and groups?
I can talk a little bit about what we are doing in Australia under the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program that both Pete and I are part of. And so within that program, we don't do any even research or intervention on the reef without at a minimum obtaining free and prior informed consent from the indigenous people, the people who are related to that particular sea country. But we're really striving to having collaborative research projects where they work as researchers with us, or eventually even having traditional owner-led research programs. So we really, and we talk to them and use their scientific knowledge, their historical knowledge, of course, and combine it with our sort of more Western scientific knowledge. I don't know, Peter, you want to add to that? I think it's working really well here within the REP program.
Yeah, I agree, and obviously it's a journey, and the journey has begun, and that's critical. But I mean, I think one of the great things about some restoration methods is that they're a great galvanizing activity for communities, and none of this stuff can really be done at scale without community involvement. And there's some really great examples of that. For example, the Mars program in Indonesia, where there's an entire village goes out and shares the responsibility of trying to restore a coral reef system there. I mean, they get paid to help, but that's the kind of level of engagement that's needed to really move this stuff forward.
And anyone have experiences from places that are not Australia? Jack, Laurie, Jessica?
Yeah, I can start maybe if it's helpful. I mean, one of your first questions was when should we get involved? And my first answer to that was, well, we should have been involved decades ago. But that's actually true. I mean, local communities here in Hawaii and many, many other places around the world have been engaged on different forms of reef restoration, stewardship, conservation, et cetera, for millennia in some cases. So I mean, if you look around the world, local communities and indigenous peoples are highly engaged in these efforts already. And the question is, I think the more interesting question is, how can the modern Western science that some of the colleagues on this call are developing, that are teaching us all sorts of things about the innovation frontier, how can we apply those in a variety of settings all across the coral reef universe, which is a daunting but innovative kind of frontier that I think we're at.
Laurie, do you have any thoughts on that, on involving local communities?
Well, we have plans. We're realizing that it takes dedicated personnel to really create a program that will do that with our own small programs here. And so we're realizing that it's something that takes additional grant funding. We really need a dedicated person to go out. We've got a lot of public support. We have social media posts, and we involve people like that. We've got some ideas about how to involve the dive community and how to involve communities during local fiestas and things like this. We got some really good ideas from watching Hawaii and how they do it. But we are realizing that is beyond our capacity with our really tiny staff to do this in a concerted way that will be meaningful. So that's actually one of our goals for our next grant writing session, and how we plan to move forward is basically say, yeah, we need somebody that will just take that by the horns and just run with it, because we know we have community members that want to get involved. We hear from them all the time. But yeah, it does take concerted planning and effort, and yeah, you need the staff to do it. I totally agree that it's absolutely essential, and it's in our plans.
Moving on a little bit. So Emily Edwards has asked, how do we navigate some of the, when the human, start again. On the human side, she says, on the human side of conservation, what are some of the challenges being navigated when the human desire for the clashes with the best solution? So maybe an ugly artificial structure will save a reef in a tourist-heavy area, or if protecting a reef interferes with fisheries behaviour. How do we navigate some of these challenges? I'll just throw it to Jessica to start with.
That's a good question. I think bringing up the fishing community is definitely, one of the biggest points I think that a lot of people would bring up, especially dealing with local communities and indigenous communities, because whatever you're doing, you don't want to interfere with, especially local subsistence fishing and things that are really impactful on livelihoods and local economies and commerce. So there's definitely a balance there. And you touched on artificial reefs. There's but I guess an idea that's getting popularity, especially when we've been talking about reefs with regards to primarily the ecological function. But in the United States, a lot of that funding is going towards coastal resilience, which means they want it to be this big barrier that protects the coastline from storms and increasing wave activity due to climate change, right? And so people are looking at the idea of hybrid reefs, which is adding structure to these reefs and then putting corals on top of them so that you've got some ecological function on top of this base function of protection. But that is a big challenge with regards to permitting, especially in the U.S. You can't put structures on top of a reef. So that is, I guess, sort of like the not necessarily the human side, but the regulatory challenge that you can deal with when you're trying to look at some of these innovative ideas that are not necessarily something that is permittable.
Jack, do you have thoughts on that question? Balancing coral reef risk, looking after coral reefs, things like fisheries and other human uses?
Yeah, I think with Jess on this one, I think it's ultimately this comes down to local priorities and how the management and governance and planning process plays out. It's very different in Hawaii than it may be in, for example, Australia. I'm sure there's some common frameworks, and indeed there's a lot of scholarship on this in the coral reef world and beyond. But ultimately, that's a sort of a local answer, right? How you might do it in Florida, we might be, come up with a different priority than you might in a community in Hawaii, for example. So yeah, I'm not sure I answered the question that well, Andrea, but I think it's highly context specific.
Yeah. Well, so one question. One other question we sort of came out of Peter's talk, which I've been wondering about, is what are some of these challenges to scaling up restoration? We've talked a lot about local projects, but how do we scale this up to the big picture?
Could I add one thought about that? I mean, this is not a problem that is unique to coral reefs, right? I mean, it's the same problem in the Amazon. It's the same problem in mangroves. We've lost 20% of the Amazon. We've lost 40% of the world's mangroves. Restoration of all of these ecosystems is extremely difficult and extremely costly. But nonetheless, we are trying to figure out how to scale restoration in all of them. And of course, the science that Peter and others are doing in this space is hugely important for figuring out how to do that, because we don't have the option not to add restoration to the mix. So I just want to say that that's sort of an ongoing global conversation in conservation, and not a unique challenge to this ecosystem type.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is the sort of $6 million question, except it's much more expensive than $6 million. I think there's one thing that has to happen, as we've said, is it needs to be something that's actionable by communities. Like that's the only way you're going to get enough people involved to do this, I think. And so it needs to be affordable. Well, it is expensive. There's no getting away from the fact that restoration's not cheap. And so there does need to be innovation in how it's financed, and a sort of maybe a belief that, restoring an ecosystem, it's more valuable than just the sheer economic costs, economic benefits that we think we get from those ecosystems. I mean, if you do an economic assessment, it doesn't always make restoration look like a very feasible mechanism. There are some exceptions to that and some circumstances, but I think we need to be bigger than that. These are important ecosystems. So we need innovation in how we finance it. I mean, people talk a lot now about whether there are new finance mechanisms available to this, things like various biodiversity credits. It's very early days, this sort of work. It's very interesting. There's a lot of innovation. People are thinking about that. And so it's great that people are working on it, because we're going to need some significant funding to do that. But, it needs to be done responsibly. And I think one of the real challenges that we've seen in some areas, and my colleague Triez Razak has written about this, is, across Indonesia, for example, there are many failed attempts at doing restoration at a small scale. And then people just leave rubbish behind on the reef, lumps of concrete and old tractor tires and things where they tried and failed. And so I think we do need a better contract with people. So whilst we need lots of people doing things, they need to behave in a code of responsibility, so that if something's not working, there's a plan to remove it and reduce those impacts. But yeah, how do you achieve scale? You certainly need to look at the R&D of how can you do it in a step change, and that is being done. There are programs looking at those questions, but at the same time we need this sort of global mobilization. And we know in a lot of aspects of society that's been achieved. You can really mobilize people to do stuff. And I work with a colleague of mine, Andy Ridley, in a program called Great Reef Census, that's been mobilizing people to get out and look at the state of reefs on the Great Barrier Reef initially. And it's had an enormous impact. It involves thousands of people around the world, 172 countries, joining forces to help interpret what's happening in parts of the Great Barrier Reef. There is a group of people out there, and people on this call, who are willing to do things. Just need to be engaged.
So I just want to sort of head towards the end of our hour. We're following another question from Amanda Lewin. She points out that coral restoration is still a relatively young field. And do you feel there's particular aspects that are particularly under-researched and hindering our project? I'm going to send that to Madeline first. Under-research and hindering our progress.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think there's lots of areas that are under research, as it is a new field of science. I think we've been doing like coral nurseries and fragmentation for decades in some parts of the world. So I think the knowledge there is quite solid and extensive. But newer methods of restoration, particularly based on sexually produced stock, moving larval slicks around and settling them, assisted evolution, reducing stress. There's some people here in Australia trying to develop cloud brightening and fogging to try and reduce light that the corals see during a summer heat wave. And all of those, they are so in the R&D stage and really are now only starting to reach sort of the field trial stage. So yeah, there's a lot of lot of under-researched areas, and we're in a race against the clock, really. So I'm not really sure I'm answering this question very well, but yeah, I think the whole field of sort of developing novel restoration techniques is on the research. I mean, a lot is happening, but it's been only a small number of years that across the world we've moved towards this R&D program.
Laurie, do you have thoughts on that? Areas that you think are under-researched for restoration? We lost Laurie? Maybe I'll get Jessica to answer that question.
Sure. I think there's a lot that still needs to be researched. I think we've said a number of times on this call that restoration and the techniques you use are very regional and very reef specific. But I think, the details of how things get done, there's a lot of documentation, a lot of guidance docs on the brush strokes, the large brush strokes of how restoration should be accomplished and what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and the guidance that you should implement in the planning phases and things like that, of that nature. That's just a higher level, but what really is still in the infancy of restoration is the nitty-gritty nuances, right? So what works best for this species? If you're working with microfragmenting, how big should that fragment be? How should you attach that to the reef? Did that method work well for that particular site, or should you do something else on this site? How do you get new coral settlers if you're working in coral spawning? What gets them to settle best? And that's going to vary by species. Some species like different colors of light. Some species like different types of substrate to settle on. How are we going to increase their survivorship? Is it better to, we're conducting a lot of studies looking at direct outplanting of corals versus rearing them either in the land-based nursery or an underwater nursery first to grow out prior to outplant. Does that elevate their survivorship at all? So all of the little minutia, I guess, of how to get corals out there and how to really get them to survive, especially in the face of all these new stressors, is really what is going to continue to need research.
And Jack, any thoughts on?
I liked where Peter was going with it, and you too, Jess. I mean, if we think about how we scale this work up, it's going to be through science, policy, finance, and markets, broadly construed, and we need to have a better understanding of all four of those, arenas if we're going to get there. So we've got, a lot of work to do, but it's also, we're behind in terms of the challenge space, right? The sort of twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate are all hitting at once, and it really is affecting communities, and it's affecting their ability to feed themselves, to maintain livelihoods and all the benefits that reefs provide. So I would just sort of end by being a little provocative and say, we know enough to act in a lot of cases. And as long as we're acting responsibly and experimenting to get there, that's all good. There's a million questions that remain unanswered, but the only one that really matters is, why aren't we doing more? We need to do more.
As a final question, we might finish out with is asking how important, it's very important. How important is this interdisciplinary collaboration, and what fields do we need to bring in and get additional fields involved and to answer these questions and to move us forward? You talk about finance and policy. Who else?
Model less. We need to model the risks and benefits of doing this at scale need to be understood, right? We don't want to end up in a situation like where we're worse off than before we started restoring. So we need to have some understanding of the risks versus benefits.
Yeah,
engineers.
The regulatory space, we really do need to have, I think, a very informed level of regulation about what are real risks versus perceived risks of restoration, so that it can proceed in a way that is responsible, but also responsive to the urgency of the challenge. I think that's a major one.
Jessica, are you final thoughts about what additional fields?
Sure. I was just saying, engineers, we actually just sent 2 of our staff to a workshop in Florida that came together to evaluate some ideas that engineering students from a local university had to shade corals or reduce their stress under heating conditions. And it was evaluated by this large panel of coral restoration practitioners all over. So I think we're going to continue to see collaborations like that between the different fields. Modelers is a really big one. We're working with a contractor right now who is modeling larval dispersal for us around a few different spots in the Caribbean that we're conducting restoration in, as well as cost-benefit analysis. We just finished a big study where we had modelers conducting cost-benefit for restoration scenarios around the island. So, I think this is we're in urgent times, and this is going to require all hands on deck. And so there's all kinds of disciplines that need to come together.
So someone on the call has suggested, Manuela Montoy has asked about AI. Do we think that AI has a role to play? New computing technologies in this field?
Will definitely speed up a lot of the R&D, and even like and the conservation aquaculture, when you're doing your process and look at fertilization success, a lot of these things can be automated. Also, the success of the intervention in the field, I think a lot of that image analysis can be automated with machine learning and other AI tools. Sure.
Machine learning.
And I think a lot of the data that you would want to guide where to do restoration and prioritize, a lot of that's very sort of tech-heavy data generation. There's a lot of scope to facilitate that. Right now, it's very expensive to do that work. It could be much cheaper if we asked AI to help.
Fantastic. And I think we seem to have lost Jack and Laurie. Is anybody, Jessica, do you have any final thoughts? No?
Sure, about AI or?
Yeah.
I will say with regards to that would be very helpful with monitoring and having something that can look through all of your enormous quantities of photogrammetric data would be very helpful. Machine learning is something that some of our science staff is starting to look into. So I think in the monitoring realm, it would be incredibly helpful.
Brilliant. So I think we're a bit over 10 minutes over the hour now. So I think we'll wrap it up there. If anybody has any panelists have any final thoughts I'd like to mention. We're going to, for the audience, a survey will pop up. We would love to have you answer that survey, and we thank you so much for joining us, particularly the people who have joined us at strange hours of the night. I know a few of you have said that you're in Gabon, Morocco. Absolutely delighted that you joined us. And I think that's all I have to do is to say thank you to our panelists. And thank you to everyone. Melissa, Carrie, do you want to say anything? No, thank you.
Thanks for everyone coming out.
Thanks
so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.